like you to turn to Isaiah 5. That's on page 690. Isaiah 5, I'm going to read the first 7 verses. I sound quite loud today. That's good. Isaiah 5, verse 1, the Song of the Vineyard, page 690. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. We've got another reading to come from the New Testament a little later. One. Maybe Ian, we could shut the door. Yeah, or Alan, that's great. Matthew 21, that's on page 989 of the Church Bibles, 989. Matthew 21, I'm going to read the parable of the tenants in the vineyard. As you can see from what we read earlier, it's very, very relevant. Matthew 21, verse 33. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall round it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. When he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them in the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied. And he'll rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. This is God's holy word. Now turn back to Isaiah, where we're going through the early chapters of Isaiah on Sunday mornings running up to Christmas. And today we're going to look at the whole of chapter 5, which is a bit of a marathon, but I'm going to try and do most of it as a bit of a rapid overview. Let me start by saying that when we come to the opening chapters of the book of Isaiah, the prophet speaks very boldly of the idolatry of his day, yes? And there is great spiritual darkness in the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and they stand in danger of God's judgment. Now, it's easy for us as Christians gathered here in church this morning to think, okay, that's easy to read. That's talking about all of them out there. That's talking about our evil, sick society. And we can sit here and read these words and feel a little bit smug. Surely this kind of people that Isaiah is preaching against are the folk out there in society, aren't they? Surely it's the evil in the world around us, not the evil in the church that he's talking about. Now, it is true that Isaiah speaks prophetically to his culture, to his age, and therefore, there are plenty of applications to our culture and our age. But he leaves much of his message for the surrounding nations to sort of later on, after chapter 12. Here, in these opening chapters 1 to 5, he's speaking very specifically to Judah and Jerusalem and also to the northern kingdom of Israel. He is speaking to God's people. Now, he's going to have lots to say about the pagan nations around them, but he's speaking to his chosen people when he says all of this. Now, what's the equivalent of Israel and Judah in the Old Testament when we come to the New Testament? It's not the world around us, is it? It's the church. Therefore, this passage is speaking to us as a church, and it's speaking to the churches of our country, isn't it? It applies to us as his church in the New Testament. Now, you may have come to church today, as I have, rather despondent about the vote in Parliament on Friday, wondering whether this bill might fail at some stage as it goes through Parliament. And it's very easy, isn't it, to want to come into church and to shut out the evil society outside and to say, right, we've just come to be God's people together in a little huddle. But what God is saying here is for the church. And I want to expound it as it applied to Israel and Judah, and then apply it to us. But I'll make this promise to you as we start, okay? We are going to finish in the light. We're going to go into quite a dark valley, but we're going to finish in the light, and we're going to leap from this passage to a great New Testament passage, which I haven't read yet. So do stay with me. I will bring you hope this morning in the midst of this message of doom. So let's think first of all about the song of the vineyard in verses 1 to 7. It's interesting, isn't it, that Isaiah begins with a song. I think I've only ever embarrassed myself in church when I've sung while preaching. I did it once in South Africa, and my daughter has never forgiven me. She was with me at the time, and I don't propose to sing now. But actually, it's quite a clever device for getting the attention of his hearers. Let me sing you a song. Oh yeah, go ahead. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. Wow, a love song, wonderful. And once the songs grab their attention, he's going to stick a really nasty twist in the middle of the song. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones, because in Israel and Judah, the mountainsides were very rocky. You had to work hard to get a decent field, like farmers in the Cotswolds. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. So who's the beloved? Who's he actually singing about? He's singing about God. God has redeemed Israel from Egypt, as Junior Church are finding out this morning. He's brought them out of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've gone on their wilderness journey into the Promised Land, and God has settled them into the Promised Land. And it's like the Promised Land is God's vineyard. Okay, he's settled them there. They have everything they need: peace from their enemies, homes to live in, land to farm, a harvest, and most important of all, at the heart of their national life, they have the temple. They can go and worship God in the temple and have their sin forgiven and be at peace with God. So God has gone to great lengths to ensure that the people of Israel have everything they need to live in the land. And that's a picture, isn't it, in this parable. It's like a man building a vineyard, clearing the land, planting only the best quality vines, the really strong fruiting varieties that are disease resistant and the vine weevils don't get them and all the rest of it, taking all the rocks out of the soil and putting them at the edge to build a wall around the vineyard so that wild animals don't get in. And then later on we find he's planted a thorn bush hedge around the outside of that so that nobody else gets in. And he's preparing for a big harvest. And you'd expect that harvest, that vineyard, to flourish, wouldn't you? Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Or as some translations say, sour grapes. But we obviously realize that means something else. It yielded only bad fruit. Now actually, this is a theme across our Bibles. It's not just in this passage in Isaiah. If you know Psalm 80 describes God creating a vineyard, and he's describing exactly the same thing. And then the psalmist is crying out because the exile has come, and they've been sent into exile, and the vineyard is trampled down by wild boars and all the rest of it. It's a very powerful psalm to read, Psalm 80, and he pleads for God to turn his face and have mercy. And then we have the parable that I read in Matthew 21, where Jesus uses the same story, but he kind of gives it a different twist, doesn't he? The owner of the vineyard builds his vineyard, he lets it out to tenants, and when he sends his servants to collect some of the harvest for rent, they beat up his servants, some of them they kill, and finally he sends his son, and they do not respect his son, they kill him as well. And that's exactly what Israel did with Jesus, isn't it? That they rejected Jesus, the leadership of Israel crucified Jesus and shouted, "Away with him, away with him." Now Jesus was good to tell those who opposed him that they were no better than their forefathers who treated the prophets the same way. You see, the Pharisees in the days of Jesus would have said, "Oh, Isaiah was a wonderful prophet." The problem was that their forebears, going right the way back, they were the ones who wanted to kill people like Isaiah. We believe that Isaiah was cut in two. There's a little hint to it in the book of the letter to the Hebrews, that Isaiah was cut in two. Just a terrible end to this great prophet. They have heard the voice of God speaking through his prophet, and they have ignored it, and they have wandered into their sin and idolatry. So God says, verse 3, "Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard." And you can hear the passion in his words here. "What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? Look at all the blessings that you've had. Look at all the truth I've revealed to you. And still you reject me. When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad?" Why would the people of God wander away from God? It seemed incredible, but in Isaiah's day, that is exactly what had happened. Now, come to our day. Look at churches across this country and see the danger that exists for Grace Church Didcot as well. We all so easily fall into the same trap. You can have churches that were known for putting the gospel at the heart of their life, that were famous for taking the gospel out into their community. They had mission campaigns to go all around their town and sing in the streets and invite people to special meetings proclaiming the gospel and putting a Bible in every house. And then they enjoyed the whiff of success. See, that's always the danger, isn't it? You become a really big church, and hundreds of people are coming, and you get fascinated with the numbers coming through the doors. And in our 21st century, you want to look attractive on social media. You want to look, very desirable, to have great cakes and coffee and everything in all the photos, and the place has to look like a palace and all the rest of it. And then some of the leaders might indulge in power games. The wrong type of men take over. Empire builders, bullies, men who seek a cult of personality. Or maybe going in a different direction, church, I mean, we can't imagine this, can we? But church becomes a fashion statement. And everybody has to turn up looking smart and cool and discussing where they got their hair done or where they've just been on holiday or boasting about their car or whatever it might be. And then the leaders get worried because they've had all this success and all these numbers, and then they start to think, well, actually, we've got to sustain this, and the culture is turning against us. So maybe we better start listening to the culture a bit more and going along with its evil from time to time. And so when the church needed church discipline, sin was openly tolerated and then affirmed. And where do you end up when you have a church like that? You end up with a church that, like Israel and Judah, does not know God, because steadily and gradually and little by little they have been slowly ignoring him and passing over big parts of his word. And the gospel has been replaced by another agenda. And the idolatries of the middle class have taken over. And a church has been so concerned to be popular and successful that it has managed to tolerate evil and abuse. And if you think I'm making this up, I wish I was. But I've seen it in 30 years in ministry. The churches that were being lauded as great success stories when I started have been broken apart by scandal. And it's happened again and again. Some of you may have listened to the rather grueling podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, describing a church in Seattle. And it investigates how abuse creeps into a church. And it's a grim listen. And some of the episodes are about 2 hours long. But it is a tract for our times. And it could have come straight out of the book of Isaiah. The sad fact is, this is happening in far too many churches in this country. So we must not think that we are immune. All right? That's really important. And also, note this, when this happened in Israel, what did God do? Well, verse 5, now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard, he says. I will take away its hedge. What happens if you take away the hedge? Well, the burglars get in, because the thorn hedge was keeping them out. I will take down its wall, and then the wild animals will get in as well, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. Now, that is the strongest prediction of exile that you could possibly hope for. That's exactly what happened to Israel and Judah. By and large, the enemy had not been allowed to get into Israel's homeland, the promised land. They'd been kept out. But now God uses Israel's enemies to come in as an act of judgment. He takes away his protection. And first of all, Israel, the northern kingdom, and then later under Babylon, the southern kingdom of Judah, are taken away into exile. And Israel is trampled by foreign powers. And Jerusalem itself, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonian army, and Jerusalem became a place of ruins. So, a grim subject, isn't it? But what is the New Testament equivalent of that kind of exile? Well, I think it is when God takes a church and he closes it down, sadly. And in the opening chapters of the book of Revelation, we have the famous 7 letters to the 7 churches of Revelation. And God says very clearly that you've left your first love, and therefore if you do not repent, I will come and I will remove your lampstand from its place. Which is a very sort of cryptic way of saying, I will close that church down. I will end its witness. And the truth is, churches are closing down all over this country, aren't they? Now, many of them are dying because they've wandered away from the gospel, or they've tolerated terrible sin, or there's dreadful abuse. But here's the thing, there are also Bible churches that die, and we could be one of them. Churches that are founded on the gospel, but after a while they just get into the habit of coming to church, and their lives are never changed. The gospel never drives them to repentance. It's just a habit. We're coming together to sing hymns and go through the routine and preach our way through the Bible, but we're not real. Do you see the point? There's not a real pulsating spiritual life there. And that's where we get more concerned about our comfort than our mission, isn't it? So this is the song of the vineyard that Isaiah sings. And just in case they hadn't got it, he says in verse 7, look, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice. But what did he find? He found bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress. God looked for justice and righteousness in Israel. That is, godly living, fairness, treating people justly, and wanting to obey God and walk in his ways. That's what he looked for. And instead he found a catalogue of evil, and that's why they had to go into exile. Now, I don't know about you, but I just have a feeling that when the people of Israel heard Isaiah say this, I wonder if they sort of threw up their hands and said, what? Us? and really needed quite a bit of persuading, because what follows the Song of the Vineyard is this long passage of woes and judgments. Let me just give you a very brief overview rather than get sort of bogged down in this. It is very depressing stuff. There are 6 woes. The first woe is in verse 8. And it's a woe about those who add house to house, who are always extending their home and taking other people's fields and making an idol of their possessions. And God says to them, verse 9, surely the great houses will become desolate. The fine mansions will be left without occupants. And ultimately, that's what happened, wasn't it? In the exile, their homes were reduced to rubble. You know, churches can pile up wealth. We can invest in buildings. We can have all these facilities. And as we see, when we see the wrecking ball being taken to them, it can all be knocked down. It can all be taken from us. The church is the people of God, isn't it? Not its buildings. The second woe is very vivid. Woe to those who rise early in the morning to run after their drinks, who stay up late at night till they are inflamed with wine. There's a party, and the alcohol is flowing, and the people are drunk. Now, we have a huge alcohol industry in this country. It costs us as a country, are you aware of this? Alcoholism in this country costs us about £12 billion a year. It's extraordinary, isn't it? That puts some of the other debates we're having in this country into context, doesn't it? In terms of what it costs the education system and the healthcare system and social services and the prison service and the police service and so on, alcohol is a huge issue in our society, and nobody talks about it. And Isaiah describes the person who drinks and parties their way through the day, blotting out the world. This is what they're doing, verse 12. They have no regard for the deeds of the Lord, no respect for the work of his hands. In other words, we are the work of his hands. And we are made in God's image, and we have no respect for this body that he has given us. Well, now that's followed in verses 13 to 16 by another announcement of exile. Therefore, my people will go into exile for lack of understanding. They were fools, led by fools, because no one led them to God. And the exile would be a disaster for them. Many of them would die. The people will be brought low, and everyone humbled. The eyes of the arrogant humbled. But the Lord Almighty will be exalted by his justice, and the holy God will be proved righteous by his righteous acts. Jerusalem would be reduced to rubble, and sheep would graze among the ruins. Then there's woe number 3 in verse 18 and 19. And this is about deceivers and idolaters, and it describes them dragging their wickedness as with cart ropes. And that might actually be literal. It might be that they had their idols on wagons and they were pulling them along. Have you seen a great crowd, maybe on TV in India, and they're pulling an idol wagon along with them? Or you go to Latin America and they're parading the saints on a saint's day. And actually what they're doing is they've taken paganism and sort of baptized it into Christianity. There is a dreadful deception in religious idolatry. and it drags people away from the living God. And then they start complaining, don't they? They complain like the people in verse 19 who say, let God hurry, let him hasten his work so that we may see it. Where is God? What's he doing? And they're just ignorant of the God that they should know. And then you've got a fourth woe in verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Well, we've had plenty of that this week, haven't we? There are leaders who lie and label something as good, which is actually evil. Imagine going into a pharmacist's, and I'm thinking of an old-fashioned pharmacist here, okay, not one with packets, but one with bottles on the shelf. And they take a bottle of poison and they pour it into a medicine bottle for you, and they label it as tonic and say, drink this. That's effectively what he's saying, isn't it? Woe to leaders who turn moral values upside down. And then there's the fifth woe in verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. In other words, there's no humility before God, and we trust our own human reason rather than God's revelation, God's revealed wisdom. And then the sixth woe, well, this is back in the party house, isn't it? Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks. Sounds like the Turf Tavern in Oxford, doesn't it? Where the Australian Prime Minister drunk his yard of ale, setting a world record or something. Was it Bob Hawke, the Australian Prime Minister? Well, I'm not making any accusations against him as to the rest of these verses, but what they're saying is they get drunk and then they acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent. Therefore, as tongues of fire lick up straw, so their roots will decay and their flowers blow away like dust. Finally, God will come in justice. And in the final verses, verse 25 to 30, we have a description of God whistling for the nations to come. He is whistling for Assyria and then Babylon to come in judgment against all this spiritual wickedness. Now, he will have plenty to say about Assyria and Babylon later on in Isaiah, that they've done evil while they came in judgment, but they are his agents of judgment, and as God's agents of judgment, this is what he will let them do against his own people. Okay, we've reached the end of the chapter. And we can sigh and breathe a sigh, and hopefully also a sigh of relief. Where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us needing two things. Here's the first thing we need. We need a vision of the glory and the holiness of God. Yeah? And that's what we're going to get next week when we come to Isaiah 6. We've got an all-age service next week, and with the children in, we're going to look at Isaiah's wonderful vision of the Lord on his throne. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. You see, it's when we grasp the holiness of God that all our idolatries are brought low, and we are humbled, as Isaiah was in the presence of God. We are humbled and he is exalted. That's where healthy spiritual life starts, isn't it? When we start to appreciate the holiness of God and our own humility. But it also leaves us feeling utterly helpless. Isaiah will cry out in Isaiah 6, woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a nation of unclean lips. And I have seen the Lord of glory. And he's undone by that experience. So do you notice what follows Isaiah 6? Isaiah 7 to 12 is what we call the Book of Emmanuel. It's a wonderful name, isn't it? The Book of Emmanuel. Because it contains so many promises about the coming of Jesus, and that's why we're looking at it in December. So chapter 7, you will call his name Emmanuel, God with us. A virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Chapter 9, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. It's wonderful news, and we want to shout those words out, don't we, every carol service. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. It's wonderful news. And then we rush to the tree in chapter 11, but do notice something at the end of chapter 10. Chapter 10, verse 33, see, the Lord Almighty will lop off the boughs with great power. The lofty trees will be felled, the tall ones will be brought low. That's the judgment of God against his people for their idolatry. But then he says, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. Jesus, the greater son of David, will spring up and bring healing and redemption in his wings. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment. And then, wonderfully, chapter 12, Isaiah says, in that day you will say, I will praise you, Lord. Although you were angry with me, your anger has turned away, and you have comforted me. You see, the early chapters of Isaiah, chapters 1 to 5, are full of judgment, but they give way to this wonderful book of Emmanuel. And I want to give you just a flavor of that today, to cheer you up, because I think we might need it at the end of what we've looked at today. But I'm not finished. Let's go to the New Testament and John chapter 15. And when you've read it in the light of this song of the vineyard, it suddenly becomes very, very powerful. You see, the vineyard was a picture of Israel. And what happened? Israel failed. They produced sour grapes. They produced foul, inedible fruit. They were an utter disappointment to God. But Jesus is the new Israel. In other words, he's the second Adam, the one who does what Adam failed to do and what Israel failed to do. Israel were called to be the holy people of God, and they failed. And Jesus has come to be the one who obeys where they have failed. So when God looked at Israel, he said, when I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? But when he looks at Jesus, Jesus picks up all that language of the vineyard and he fulfills it. He is the good fruit. And he uses all that language of the vineyard about himself. Just hear the triumph and the victory and the glory of these words when Jesus says at the beginning of John 15, I am the true vine. Oh, wonderful, at last. We have a true vine, a vine that bears fruit, a vine that's righteous, a vine that's good, a vine we can rejoice in. Jesus is saying, I am the one you came longing for, and I am the one who will never disappoint you. The one who will always bear good fruit. And what does he call us to do? He calls us to be united to him, to be grafted into his vine, if you like. If we follow him and are united to Jesus, we will find him to be our life and our hope, living within us and changing us. If, on the other hand, we claim to follow him, but it's all fake, what does Jesus say? Jesus says he'll cut off the branch that's fake, that's not really connected to the vine. You know, the dead branch that isn't alive, he will cut it off. Every branch in me that bears no fruit, my Father will cut off. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, he disciplines, so that it will be even more fruitful. And it's the word of the gospel that makes us clean. Jesus, as we believe in him, has by his death taken away our sin and given us new life. And therefore, he says to us, believe that gospel. The word of the gospel has made you clean. Therefore, remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit of itself. You know, that was the problem with Israel, wasn't it? They were trying to bear God's fruit in their own strength, and they failed. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Now that's what we need as a church, isn't it? That's what the churches of this country need. And the churches in the West, churches across the world look at us astounded at what is going on. where they are growing and thriving in the face of persecution, they look at us and our self-indulgence and our evil, and they are appalled. But if we remain in Christ, we will bear much fruit. This is what we need more than anything, that we remain spiritually united to Christ, living out the gospel in our daily lives, and therefore bearing much fruit as his disciples. Let's bow our heads and pray.